When the United States entered the European War in late 1941, the Army Air Forces believed that daylight precision bombing could destroy Germany's capacity to fight. The doctrine was built around the idea that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves without needing constant fighter escort. American strategists called it the self-defending fortress concept. It rested on faith in the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator, both equipped with multiple .50 caliber machine guns and designed to fly at altitudes beyond the reach of most ground fire. The plan was to strike Germany's industrial heart in broad daylight, using the Norden bomb site to target factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs with pinpoint accuracy. British Bomber Command had already abandoned daylight raids after catastrophic losses early in the war, switching to night area bombing. The Americans chose the opposite approach, insisting that precision in daylight would shorten the war by crippling Germany's war economy. In 1942, the 8th Air Force began building its strength in Britain. At first, its targets were limited: coastal installations, submarine bases, and industrial sites in France and the Low Countries. These early missions encountered moderate resistance from German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The short range of existing Allied fighters, particularly the British Spitfire and the American P-47 Thunderbolt, was not yet a critical problem, since they could cover raids only as far as Belgium or the western edge of Germany. As the Allies sought to hit deeper inside the Reich, the range problem became impossible to ignore. Once bombers passed beyond escort range, they were exposed to the full power of the Luftwaffe's defense network. German radar stations along the coast tracked bomber formations almost from takeoff, allowing fighter controllers to vector squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf F190s directly into their paths. These interceptors climbed to high altitude and attacked in waves, focusing on formations already stretched by flak fire. The first major test of America's daylight bombing concept came in 1943. The 8th Air Force had grown large enough to mount sustained raids on targets inside Germany itself. Factories producing ball bearings, aircraft, and synthetic fuel. These materials were critical to the German war effort, and American planners believed their destruction could paralyze the enemy's ability to sustain combat operations. On August 17, 1943, the U.S. launched a deep penetration raid against two key targets: the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft works at Regensburg. The mission involved over 370 B-17s. Because of limited fighter range, the bombers could be escorted only part-way by P-47 Thunderbolts before being left to continue on their own. Once they crossed into Germany, the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader units engaged with full force. Groups like JG-26 and JG-2, flying from well-positioned airfields, struck repeatedly along the route. The result was disastrous. 60 B-17s were lost, with many more damaged beyond repair after limping back to England. Nearly 600 airmen were killed or captured. Though the mission inflicted damage on its targets, the cost far outweighed the gains. The Luftwaffe's coordination, discipline, and concentrated attacks demonstrated that unescorted bombers could not survive over Germany. Still, American commanders were reluctant to abandon their daylight doctrine. They believed that improved formation discipline, tighter defensive fire, and incremental gains in fighter range could offset the losses. The next major attempt came on October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, later known among airmen as Black Thursday. 291 B-17s went in. Without long-range escorts, they faced relentless attacks from over 300 German fighters. The Luftwaffe, using a mix of 20mm cannon and air-to-air rockets, tore into the bomber streams from head-on and from above, exploiting blind spots in the defensive arcs. 60 bombers were shot down outright. Another 138 were damaged. More than 600 American airmen were lost in a single day. The Luftwaffe had proven it could destroy bomber formations at will once the escorts turned back. The 8th Air Force suspended deep raids into Germany for the rest of 1943. By that point, the Luftwaffe's defensive system inside Europe had reached its peak effectiveness. German fighter control was based on an integrated radar network that stretched from the coast of France deep into the Reich. Each sector had its own command post, coordinating multiple fighter wings. When bomber streams crossed into German airspace, interceptors were vectored ahead to set up staggered attacks, striking the bomber formations repeatedly as they advanced. The Luftwaffe also introduced heavier fighters, including twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410, armed with 30mm cannons and underwing rockets designed specifically to break up bomber formations. The results were devastating for American crews. Every deep raid cost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of men. For the Germans, this period was the last phase of air superiority over their homeland. Experienced Luftwaffe aces, many veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, took pride in the ease with which they could destroy the invincible American bombers. They mocked the Americans' short-range escorts, knowing that once the fighters turned back at the Rhine, the bombers would be easy targets. Luftwaffe pilots often described the experience as hunting season. Units like JG-1, JG-11, and JG-26 maintained specialized tactics for attacking B-17 formations, coordinating head-on attacks that maximize the bomber's vulnerability. From late 1942 through 1943, German fighter strength in the West remained formidable, with a steady supply of replacement aircraft and pilots. Losses to Allied bombers were heavy but manageable. As long as the Luftwaffe controlled its own skies, the German armaments industry could continue operating. Inside the U.S. command structure, however, the picture looked bleak. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, faced mounting pressure from Washington and London to justify the daylight bombing campaign. British commanders argued that the losses proved the futility of daylight raids, advocating a full shift to night operations under the RAF's control. The Americans resisted, arguing that the precision capability of daylight bombing was essential to destroy specific industrial targets, something night bombing could not achieve. To make daylight raids viable, the Americans needed a way to protect bombers deep into Germany. Incremental efforts were made to extend the range of existing fighters. External drop tanks were introduced for P-47s, giving them an additional few hundred miles of range, but not enough to reach central Germany or Berlin. Some P-38 Lightnings from the Mediterranean were redeployed to Britain for long-range escort missions, but the twin-engine fighters suffered mechanical problems in Europe's cold, humid climate. Through the winter of 1943, the air offensive slowed. American bombers continued to hit targets in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, but the planned strategic offensive against the heart of the Reich, oil facilities, aircraft plants, and ball-bearing factories, was effectively stalled. The Luftwaffe used the respite to rebuild strength and prepare for the next Allied push. By early 1944, the situation had reached a strategic crossroads. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Western Europe. But air superiority was a prerequisite. The bomber offensive had to resume, and it had to succeed. Without control of the skies, any invasion would face overwhelming air attack. The U.S. Army Air Forces now understood that no matter how heavily armed bombers were, they could not defend themselves against concentrated fighter attacks over enemy territory. The only way to sustain daylight operations was with a fighter that could accompany them to the target and back. The Germans, confident in their system, saw no indication that such a fighter existed. To them, the Americans were bound by physics. Their aircraft would always run out of fuel before reaching the heart of Germany. Luftwaffe intelligence assessed that Allied escorts could not reach beyond Hanover or Frankfurt, leaving the central industrial belt, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, Berlin, safely beyond escort coverage. This confidence would soon collapse. Unknown to the German command, a new American fighter was already entering service in late 1943, one that combined long range with superior performance. Within months, it would appear deep over Germany, flying alongside the same bomber formations that had once been helpless targets. The Luftwaffe pilots who had laughed at Allied escorts would soon face an entirely different war in the skies over the Reich. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a battle of endurance, a test between the American bomber offensive and the German defensive system built to destroy it. Inside Germany, the Luftwaffe had organized one of the most sophisticated air defense networks of the war. It was designed specifically to exploit the Allies' greatest weakness, limited escort range. Every major raid from Britain was detected long before the bombers crossed the coast. German radar stations, part of the Kammhuber line, stretched from Denmark to southern France. These early warning systems picked up bomber formations as soon as they left British airspace. Information was relayed to Luftwaffe command posts, which coordinated interception through a network of radio beacons and ground controllers. Fighter wings could be scrambled and positioned along the bomber route long before the Americans reached their targets. The defensive structure of the Reich's airspace was divided into zones, each under the control of a Jagd division, a fighter division responsible for specific sectors. These divisions were in turn made up of Jagdgeschwader, or fighter wings, each composed of multiple Gruppen. Within minutes of a radar report, ground controllers could vector dozens of Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters into altitude positions ahead of the bomber streams. The timing was precise. German fighters would form up at designated assembly points, refuel or rearm as needed, and launch sequential attacks as the bombers moved deeper inland. Once the Allied escorts turned back, typically near the German frontier, the real battle began. German interceptors waited just beyond the reach of Allied fighters. As soon as the escorts peeled away, radar controllers ordered multiple Jagdgeschwader to converge on the incoming formation. The result was a carefully layered defense, not a chaotic dogfight. The first wave would disrupt bomber formations with head-on attacks. Subsequent waves would pick off stragglers or damaged aircraft. The Luftwaffe's high command, under General Adolf Galland and General Joseph Schmid, had refined these tactics since 1942. Experience from the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front gave German pilots a deep understanding of bomber vulnerabilities. They preferred head-on attacks, where the closure speed reduced the effectiveness of defensive fire. The B-17's most exposed area was its nose, which had fewer guns. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, German fighters could open fire with 20mm and 30mm cannons before the bomber's top turrets could engage. A single cannon burst could cripple a bomber's engines or ignite its fuel tanks. Luftwaffe units such as Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageder, JG-1 Oisau, and JG-11 became specialists in bomber interception. They were led by highly experienced aces, men like Walter Oisau, Gunther Rahl, and Egon Mayer, each credited with dozens or even hundreds of victories. Many of them had fought since 1939 and had thousands of flight hours. The combination of skill, organization, and experience made the Luftwaffe a deadly opponent. To counter the bomber's defensive firepower, German engineers developed new weapons and tactics. Heavily armed twin-engine fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Me-410 were modified for the Zerstörer destroyer role. They carried 30mm Mk-108 cannons and air-to-air rockets like the Werfer Granit 21. These weapons could be fired from beyond the bomber's effective defensive range, breaking up the tight formations and allowing single-engine fighters to finish the attack. Some Mi-410s were even fitted with upward-firing cannons to strike from beneath, targeting bombers' vulnerable undersides. In the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe's defensive system reached its most lethal phase. The 8th Air Force continued to press raids deeper into Germany despite staggering losses. Between August and October, the Schweinfurt Regensburg missions became the defining examples of how dangerous the unescorted raids had become. The first Schweinfurt Regensburg raid, on August 17, 1943, had demonstrated both the potential and the peril of America's daylight strategy. The raid was intended as a two-part mission. One force would strike the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg and continue to North Africa. The second would attack the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and return to England. The timing was designed to divide the Luftwaffe's response, forcing German fighters to choose between two distant targets. However, poor coordination and weather delays caused both groups to pass through the same airspace hours apart, allowing the Luftwaffe to redeploy its interceptors and hit each wave in turn. Fighter wings, JG-3, JG-11, and JG-26 coordinated multiple attacks along the route. By the time the surviving bombers reached their targets, the formations were shredded. Out of 376 B-17 launches, 60 were lost and 95 were damaged. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, reinforced the lesson. The Luftwaffe was waiting in force, and once the limited P-47 escorts turned back, more than 300 German fighters attacked. The bombers fought alone for nearly 2 hours. 60 were shot down, and many more were wrecked beyond repair after crash landing in England. The mission inflicted serious damage on the ball-bearing plants, but at a cost that no command could sustain. For the Luftwaffe, these battles confirmed that the defensive system worked. Each raid depleted the 8th Air Force's strength, forcing constant replacements of aircraft and crews. The Luftwaffe's own losses were rising too, but far less dramatically. Many of its aces continued to dominate the skies, and their confidence grew. German pilots frequently mocked American airmen in radio intercepts and propaganda broadcasts, calling the daylight raids suicide missions. The term Gefechtsfreie Zone, combat-free zone, was used to describe the airspace over central Germany, an area where German pilots could attack without fear of Allied fighters. The Germans also recognized patterns in the Allied offensive. The Americans relied on predictable flight paths, weather conditions, and target types. Luftwaffe intelligence units tracked these patterns, allowing interceptors to position themselves in advance. The defensive system was so effective that some bomber groups reported being attacked in relay by as many as 20 different fighter units along a single route. The Luftwaffe also began deploying experimental tactics. Some groups, such as JG-300, used night-fighting aircraft to conduct surprise attacks through cloud cover. Others introduced heavily armored FW-190s, configured specifically for ramming damaged bombers, though this tactic remained rare. As losses mounted, the 8th Air Force began rotating its squadrons to shorter missions and reducing deep penetration raids altogether. Despite the Luftwaffe's dominance, signs of strain were emerging. While Germany maintained numerical strength, the quality of its replacement pilots was declining. Veteran aces still achieved high kill counts, but many younger pilots arrived with only minimal training. The intensity of the fighting in both East and West forced the Luftwaffe to divide its resources, leaving home defenses stretched thin. Nonetheless, in late 1943, the defense of the Reich was still largely effective. On the ground, the Germans were also refining their coordination between radar control, flak defenses, and fighter interception. Heavy anti-aircraft batteries, the Flak artillery, formed the first barrier. These units ringed major industrial centers like Hamburg, Stuttgart, and Munich. Radar-directed flak could reach bomber formations at 25,000 feet, forcing them to maintain predictable flight paths and altitudes. This made the bombers even more vulnerable to interceptors waiting ahead. Flak damage forced formations to tighten up, which improved defensive fire concentration, but also made them easier targets for German fighters aiming at the dense clusters of aircraft. It was an environment in which every mile deeper into Germany increased the likelihood of destruction. The Luftwaffe's psychological edge was significant. Interrogations of captured American airmen revealed widespread awareness of the Reich defense zone. Crews knew that once they crossed the Rhine, they were entering territory where no help could reach them. Mission briefings included phrases like, "Expect heavy opposition beyond Frankfurt," a coded acknowledgement that escort fighters would soon turn home. German propaganda capitalized on this. Radio Berlin broadcasts boasted that American bombers will not see Berlin in daylight. Luftwaffe aces were celebrated as national heroes, with newspapers printing their victory tallies and describing how they swept the sky clear of invaders. For a brief period, this confidence was justified. The Luftwaffe's defensive campaign inflicted losses so severe that Allied planners began questioning whether the daylight bombing strategy could continue. In December 1943, General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, admitted that without effective long-range escort, deep raids into Germany were unsustainable. American bomber strength was being depleted faster than it could be replaced. The 8th Air Force had lost nearly 1,000 bombers in just a few months of operations. Crew losses exceeded 10,000 men. The Luftwaffe, though bleeding from constant combat, still held control of the airspace over its homeland. To the Germans, this seemed proof that technology and tactics favored defense. They believed the Reich's air defenses could hold indefinitely, buying time for new advanced weapons, like the Me-262 jet fighter, to change the balance again. But beneath the surface, the Luftwaffe's dominance was fragile. Its pilot training program was being compressed to fill losses, fuel shortages were beginning to limit flight hours, and attrition was eroding the cadre of veteran aces. At the same time, the Allies were improving navigation, intelligence, and bombing accuracy. The arrival of a true long-range escort fighter would exploit every weakness in the Luftwaffe's system. Until then, the skies over Germany remained deadly ground, a vast, invisible front line where the Luftwaffe still ruled. Every deep mission by the 8th Air Force paid the same price in men and machines. German pilots continued to watch American bombers burn across their skies and scoff at the idea that any Allied fighter could ever follow them to Berlin. Their overconfidence would not last. In early 1944, the assumptions that had defined air combat over Europe would collapse. The combat-free zone would vanish almost overnight, replaced by relentless Allied escorts flying deeper than any German pilot believed possible. The Luftwaffe's killing ground was about to become its graveyard. By the end of 1943, the daylight bombing campaign stood on the edge of collapse. The 8th Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe dominated its own skies, and the belief in self-defending bombers was dead. The Allied command understood that without a fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into Germany and back, the strategic air offensive could not continue. That solution finally arrived in the form of a new American fighter, the P-51 Mustang. Unlike its predecessors, it combined high performance with extraordinary range. allowing it to accompany bombers to targets that had once been unreachable. Its appearance in significant numbers in early 1944 transformed the air war over Europe. The first P-51s to arrive in Britain were initially assigned to reconnaissance and ground attack roles. However, the version now entering service, the P-51B, had the range to reach Berlin with drop tanks. The new fighter was quickly assigned to the 8th Air Force's escort groups. By December 1943, the first Mustang-equipped units were operational, including the 354th Fighter Group, temporarily attached to the 9th Air Force, but soon flying escort for the 8th. From the start, the Mustang's role was not to replace the P-47 or P-38, but to extend coverage. The U.S. Air Forces created an overlapping escort system. P-47s covered the early stages of a mission, P-38s extended into Western Germany, and P-51s pushed beyond, to Leipzig, Munich, and Berlin. By early 1944, this layered escort plan ensured that bombers were rarely without cover. The Luftwaffe first encountered Mustangs in small numbers in late 1943. German pilots initially mistook them for the British Spitfire, until combat revealed the aircraft's unmatched speed and endurance. The Mustang could cruise for hours at high altitude, accompany the bomber streams across Germany, and still have fuel to engage in extended dogfights on the return trip. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not wait for escorts to turn back, because they no longer did. In January 1944, the Allied air campaign entered a new phase. Under the command of General James Doolittle, the 8th Air Force adopted a far more aggressive policy. Doolittle recognized that escorts were no longer needed solely to protect bombers. They could now go on the offensive, hunting the Luftwaffe itself. The new directive allowed fighters to range ahead of bomber formations and attack German airfields, interceptors, and fuel depots before they reached the bombers. This change in tactics marked the beginning of the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe. The Mustang's long range made it the ideal tool for this mission. P-51s could sweep 50 to 100 miles in front of the bomber stream, break up intercept formations, and then rejoin the bombers later in the mission. Luftwaffe fighter units that had once assembled unopposed now found themselves attacked before they could climb to altitude. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. It was a coordinated series of raids on Germany's aircraft industry, a direct challenge to the Luftwaffe's strength. The goal was to destroy fighter production facilities and lure German interceptors into battle under conditions favorable to the Allies. Over 7 days, the 8th and 15th Air Forces dispatched thousands of bombers against targets in Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, and Brunswick. For the first time, the bombers had effective escort deep into Germany. Mustang groups from the 354th, 357th, and 4th Fighter Groups accompanied formations all the way to the targets. The Luftwaffe committed nearly every available interceptor to defend critical aircraft factories, launching hundreds of sorties daily. But the results were catastrophic for Germany. In earlier months, Luftwaffe fighters could engage bombers repeatedly during a mission, striking on ingress and egress. Now, P-51s disrupted those patterns. German controllers found their interceptors intercepted. Takeoffs were met by strafing attacks. Climbing formations were bounced before they could form up. The Luftwaffe's carefully structured defense zones began to unravel. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 fighters and hundreds of experienced pilots. Allied losses remained high. Nearly 250 bombers were destroyed. But the long-term balance shifted. German industry could replace aircraft faster than pilots. The loss of trained airmen, especially Staffelführer and seasoned formation leaders, was a blow the Luftwaffe could not recover from. By March 1944, the P-51 was being delivered in larger numbers. Entire groups transitioned from Thunderbolts to Mustangs. The 357th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Tommy Hayes and including future aces like Chuck Yeager, quickly established itself as one of the top-performing units. Their missions demonstrated what long-range escort truly meant. On March 4, 1944, P-51s escorted B-17s all the way to Berlin and back. The first successful daylight strike on the German capital with continuous fighter cover. For the Luftwaffe, this moment signaled the end of the safe zone. The psychological impact was immediate. German pilots, once accustomed to engaging unescorted bombers at will, now found themselves attacked at every altitude and from every direction. The same formations they had hunted for 2 years were now flanked by agile escorts capable of following them even through climb and dive maneuvers. The Mustangs also introduced new tactical flexibility. Their endurance allowed them to loiter over airfields and wait for returning German aircraft, catching them during landing or takeoff. Strafing missions became a regular feature of P-51 operations. Between March and May 1944, Mustang groups destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground, targeting dispersal airfields across northern and central Germany. This offensive use of escorts changed Luftwaffe planning. German controllers could no longer concentrate interceptors in a single defensive corridor. They now had to disperse their forces to protect multiple regions simultaneously. Fuel shortages worsened the problem. Each interception required significant fuel expenditure, and as Allied bombers continued to strike synthetic fuel plants, operational flying hours for the Luftwaffe fell drastically. German reports from the period describe the growing chaos in the defensive system. Communications breakdowns, delayed takeoffs, and shortage of experienced controllers meant that fighter formations often arrived too late or too scattered to mount effective attacks. The old method of layered intercept waves became impossible under constant pressure from roving escorts. By mid-1944, the Mustang's presence forced a complete re-evaluation of Luftwaffe tactics. Gallen's staff debated whether to engage the bombers at all, given the attrition being suffered by their pilots. But the defense of the Reich was politically and militarily non-negotiable. Hitler demanded that every raid be opposed, regardless of losses. The result was a pattern of unsustainable combat. German fighters thrown into battle against overwhelming numbers, with no chance to regroup. During the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's top aces recorded some of their last major victories. But these successes came at extreme cost. Many of the veterans who had led Germany's air defenses since 1940 were shot down in combat with P-51s. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot dropped below 10 missions. The Mustang's performance also enabled new escort tactics for the American bomber groups. Instead of staying in tight defensive formations, bombers could now spread out over wider corridors, reducing collision risk and increasing bombing accuracy. Fighter escort groups divided into close cover and sweep elements, one remaining with the bombers, the other engaging enemy aircraft ahead. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt with emergency measures. Units began launching massed frontal attacks with Sturmgruppen, heavily armored F-190s armed with 30mm cannons designed to penetrate bomber formations. These formations inflicted serious damage on several missions, notably the April 11th raid on Oschersleben. But every success was followed by devastating losses when P-51s intercepted the retreating attackers. The Luftwaffe could no longer strike without being struck back immediately. American pilots, meanwhile, refined their own tactics through constant combat. The Mustang's speed, range, and maneuverability allowed experienced pilots to dictate engagements. The kill ratio in air combat began to shift dramatically. By May 1944, P-51 groups were claiming nearly 5 enemy aircraft destroyed for every loss of their own. As the Allied air offensive intensified, the Mustang's reach extended to southern Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, areas that had never before seen American fighters. For the first time, no part of the Reich was beyond Allied reach. German aircraft factories, oil plants, and transportation hubs were attacked with unprecedented precision. The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots was profound. Reports from captured German airmen frequently mention frustration and disbelief. They could no longer take off, climb, or land without encountering Allied fighters. Training fields were attacked, making it dangerous even to prepare replacements. The airfields around Munich, Regensburg, and Hanover became frequent targets of strafing sweeps, wiping out aircraft before they could enter combat. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over Western Europe had been broken. The P-51's long-range Escort had done what months of unescorted bombing could not. It destroyed the German fighter force as a combat organization. The timing was critical. With the Allied invasion of France imminent, air superiority was now absolute. In the months that followed, Mustangs continued to expand their role beyond escort duty. They hunted locomotives, trucks, and ground convoys in what became known as fighter sweeps or freelance missions. Every day, groups of P-51s roamed deep into enemy territory, denying the Luftwaffe any chance to recover. The fighter that could finally go the distance had turned the strategic air war from a defensive struggle into an offensive campaign. The Luftwaffe's carefully built killing ground had become a battlefield it could no longer control. German pilots who once mocked the short-legged escorts now faced them over Berlin, Leipzig, and Munich, and realized the balance of the war in the air had shifted forever. By the dawn of 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had entered its most critical phase. The Allies had endured 2 years of staggering losses trying to strike at Germany's industrial core. Now, for the first time, they possessed a fighter that could go the distance, the P-51 Mustang. With it, the 8th Air Force set its sights on the heart of the Reich itself. The objective was simple, but immense. Break the Luftwaffe in the air, destroy its means of production on the ground, and clear the skies for the invasion of Europe. The symbol of that goal was one city, Berlin. To reach it meant flying 1,000 miles through some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. For 2 years, the Americans had tried and failed. But in March 1944, that changed. On March 4, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched a formation of B-17 flying fortresses toward the German capital. This was not the first attempt. Earlier efforts had been turned back by weather and losses, but it was the first to succeed under full escort. Leading the way were the P-51s of the 354 Fighter Group, operating out of Boxted, England. When the bombers crossed into Germany, German radar operators tracked them and sent out the alarm. Luftwaffe controllers ordered up waves of Bf-109s and Phoebe-190s from Jagdgeschwader 11 and Jagdgeschwader 300. These were elite formations, veterans of years of combat. Their mission was to annihilate the incoming bombers before they reached Berlin, just as they had done so many times before. But this time, the bombers were not alone. The Mustangs stayed with them all the way, climbing with the formations, weaving above and around, waiting for the attack. When the first German groups appeared, the P-51s didn't stay defensive. They went on the hunt. Captain William T. Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group later recalled that day. "We saw them forming up for an attack. We just rolled over and went straight for them. They never expected us to be there." The ensuing battles raged across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. pursued even as they tried to disengage. Dozens of German aircraft went down. For the first time, the Americans reached Berlin, dropped their bombs, and came home, with their escorts still flying beside them. The psychological blow was enormous. The German capital had been bombed before by the RAF at night. But daylight raids under Escort shattered the myth of German invulnerability. Goering himself, once proud of his Luftwaffe's control of the skies, reportedly fumed that no enemy fighter will ever fly over the Reich. Now, hundreds of them did, in broad daylight. After the first successful raid, the American High Command knew what had to come next. A relentless campaign to draw out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it tried to resist. Throughout March and April 1944, the P-51s led the offensive. Their long range and superior performance allowed them to do something unprecedented. Not merely escort bombers, but sweep ahead of them, clearing the skies before the bomber stream arrived. These operations, known as fighter sweeps, turned the Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine upside down. Traditionally, German fighters climbed to intercept the bomber formations as radar tracked them across Europe. But now, as soon as they took off, Allied fighters were waiting. American groups such as the 4th, 357th, and 352nd began ranging hundreds of miles into Germany on these sweeps. They attacked airfields, communications lines, and any aircraft that dared to show itself. The Luftwaffe's ground crews began to dread the sound of Mustangs appearing over their bases at dawn, guns blazing through parked aircraft before the day's sorties could even launch. The effect was devastating. Between March and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,500 aircraft, many of them destroyed on the ground. But numbers alone didn't tell the full story. The quality of German pilots was collapsing. Allied intelligence noted that replacement pilots were arriving with barely 100 flying hours, half what was once considered minimal. Fuel shortages and destroyed training schools compounded the crisis. Every time the Luftwaffe sent up its fighters to defend against the bombers, it paid an irreplaceable experience. The Americans, meanwhile, were refining a new doctrine. Escort fighters were no longer shackled to bomber formations. Under General James Doolittle's orders, the fighters were free to roam, to seek and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it might be. That order, issued in early 1944, was revolutionary. It turned the entire escort concept on its head. Instead of protecting bombers passively, the fighters now went on the offensive, ensuring that fewer German aircraft would even reach the bombers at all. This doctrine quickly proved its worth. The previous month's operation argument, Big Week, had already shown what could happen when the Luftwaffe was forced into constant battle. The losses had gutted German strength, and the surviving formations were now fighting against time and fuel. After Big Week, the Americans refused to let up. Every major industrial center within reach became a target. Leipzig, Brunswick, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt once again. But this time, the bombers came under a moving shield of Mustangs that extended deep into the heart of Germany. By April, the P-51 had become the symbol of Allied air power. Its pilots developed reputations almost as famous as the aircraft itself. Men like George Preddy, John C. Meyer, Don Gentile, and Chuck Yeager were leading daylight sweeps that destroyed entire German formations in minutes. One of the most dramatic encounters came on March 6, 1944, the first all-out raid on Berlin. The Luftwaffe scrambled over 800 fighters to defend the capital. What followed was one of the largest air battles of the war. For hours, the sky above central Germany was filled with contrails, tracers, and burning aircraft. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had. Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 26, F-190s from JG-1, even the experimental Me-41O heavy fighters. But the escorts were everywhere. By the end of the day, the 8th Air Force had lost 69 bombers. Heavy losses, but not crippling. The Luftwaffe, however, lost over 160 fighters and many of its veteran leaders. For Germany, it was another step toward collapse. Following the Berlin raids, the Mustang groups pushed their offensive even further. They began free hunts, roving deep behind enemy lines after the bombers had turned home. Airfields at Kassel, Münster, and Hanover became regular targets. It was during these operations that the term air superiority began to have real meaning. The Americans no longer needed to fight defensive battles. They controlled when and where combat happened. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe was on the back foot across the Western Front. Radar coverage still detected incoming raids, but few fighters could respond. Fuel supplies were dwindling, and entire squadrons were grounded. The skies that had once been Germany's fortress had become its graveyard. The transformation was visible in the numbers. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe could still field around 1,500 operational fighters in the West. By June, that number had dropped below 800, and many of those were flown by inexperienced pilots. The attrition was no longer sustainable. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces were expanding their offensive in preparation for the invasion of France. The transportation plan targeted railways, bridges, and marshalling yards across occupied Europe, severing German logistics before D-Day. The Mustang's range allowed it to strike these targets in daylight and protect medium bombers over France and Belgium. Every mile gained in air control meant fewer German aircraft over Normandy when the invasion came. By late spring, the results of months of attrition were undeniable. Luftwaffe losses outpaced production. Pilot training could not keep up, and morale was collapsing. American intelligence reports from May 1944 described the Luftwaffe as disorganized, dispersed, and unable to contest airspace for long durations. The P-51, operating in coordinated sweeps with P-47s and P-38s, ensured that no German air unit could mass its strength without being intercepted. Airfields were bombed daily, fuel depots destroyed, and railway lines crippled. The Mustang had become the executioner of the Luftwaffe. On May 21, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group conducted one of the most destructive strafing missions of the war, hitting airfields around Brunswick and Kassel. In a single day, over 100 German aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Such missions, repeated across the Reich, ensured that few German fighters would be available when the Allies finally crossed the Channel. As D-Day approached, the Luftwaffe tried to conserve what remained. But Allied planners knew the battle was already decided. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, barely 300 operational German aircraft opposed more than 12,000 Allied planes. That imbalance was no accident. It was the direct result of months of relentless air warfare, a campaign waged from the freezing skies over Berlin to the muddy airfields of Normandy. The P-51 had done more than escort bombers. It had broken the Luftwaffe's back. For the men who flew the missions, the shift was tangible. In 1943, bomber crews had flown toward Germany with the grim knowledge that half their comrades would not return. By mid-1944, that fatalism was fading. Now, as Mustangs formed up alongside them, bomber crews felt something close to confidence. They could look out and see sleek fighters that would not turn back at the Rhine, that would be there when the enemy came. For the fighter pilots themselves, victory was measured in empty skies. When they crossed into Germany and found no opposition, they knew the end was near. But the cost had been high. Hundreds of P-51 pilots were lost in combat or accidents. Their graves stretched from the coast of France to the fields of Saxony. Many had flown their final missions in the weeks before D-Day, clearing the path for the greatest invasion in history. By June 1944, the air war over Europe had been turned upside down. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was shattered. Its best pilots were dead, its reserves depleted, its airfields smoking wreckage. And above it all flew the Mustang, the fighter the Germans had once mocked as a foreign curiosity, now the master of their own skies. Its ability to escort bombers to Berlin and back had done what nothing else could. It granted the Allies the air supremacy needed to invade and liberate Europe. The road to Normandy did not begin on the beaches. It began high over the clouds of Germany. In the roar of the Merlin engine, the flash of gunfire, and the long, unbroken line of P-51s escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's once feared fighter arm, the Jagdwaffe, was collapsing under the weight of relentless Allied air power. Only 2 years earlier, German fighter wings had dominated the skies over Europe. Now the very core of their organization was disintegrating. The transition from dominance to defeat had been swift, brutal, and irreversible. The turning point had come with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Continuous long-range escort stripped the Luftwaffe of its last advantage, the ability to attack unescorted bombers deep inside Germany. From early 1944 onward, German fighter groups were forced into unequal combat, facing a numerically superior, better trained, and increasingly confident enemy on every front. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe's strength on paper still seemed formidable. There were roughly 2,000 single-engine fighters listed in operational units across the Reich. With new Bf-109G and FW-190A variants entering production. But statistics masked the reality. Of those aircraft, fewer than half were combat-ready, and the quality of pilots flying them was in steep decline. Years of attrition had gutted the Luftwaffe's veteran cadre. Men who had fought since 1940 were either dead, wounded, or grounded as instructors. The new generation of pilots, rushed through an accelerated training program, often arrived at the front with less than 120 hours of total flight time, a third of what had once been standard. In combat, they were slaughtered. Meanwhile, Allied losses were easily replaced. American factories produced thousands of aircraft every month, and pilot training pipelines were running at full capacity. Every time the Luftwaffe lost a squadron, it took months to rebuild. Every time the Americans lost one, replacements arrived within weeks. The Luftwaffe command recognized the problem, but could do little to solve it. The Reich's strategic bombing campaign had shattered the German aviation industry's infrastructure. Ball-bearing factories, fuel refineries, and aircraft plants were bombed continuously from March through September 1944. The Luftwaffe was fighting for its life while losing the ability to sustain itself. Perhaps the single most decisive factor in the Luftwaffe's downfall was fuel. Allied bombers systematically targeted synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Bullin, and Politz, cutting off the supply that powered the entire German air arm. In 1943, Germany had produced around 180,000 tons of aviation fuel per month. By August 1944, production had dropped to less than 10,000 tons, barely enough to keep a fraction of the force flying. Fighter units received only enough fuel for 1 or 2 sorties per week. Training flights were virtually eliminated. New pilots were sent to the front with almost no live firing experience. Senior officers protested that they were sending men to certain death, but Hitler's orders were clear. Every aircraft must fly. American intelligence soon noticed the results. In air battles over Germany and later France, German fighters often broke off combat early, lacking fuel to pursue or evade. On the ground, hundreds of aircraft sat idle, their tanks empty. Fuel shortages also crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to move units strategically. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was unable to redeploy significant fighter strength to France. Most aircraft remained in Germany, grounded by lack of fuel or maintenance. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The Luftwaffe's response was almost non-existent. Over 12,000 Allied aircraft supported the landings. Fewer than 300 German fighters took to the air. The contrast was stark. In 1940, during the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies. 4 years later, over its own territory, it was nearly absent. Those German pilots who did manage to reach the invasion beaches faced overwhelming opposition. P-51s, P-47s, and Spitfires patrolled every altitude, intercepting any sign of resistance. The few Luftwaffe sorties that succeeded, such as Oberst Josef Priller's lone strafing run over Omaha Beach, were symbolic gestures rather than military actions. The failure to contest the air over Normandy marked the effective end of the Luftwaffe as a strategic force. From that point onward, German air units operated in a purely defensive role, protecting key industrial targets and retreating ground forces under constant Allied assault. In the months following D-Day, the Luftwaffe's situation worsened. As Allied ground forces advanced across France, the Jagdwaffe attempted to reorganize into Luftflotte Reich and Luftflotte West. But the divisions were mostly administrative. Operationally, there were simply not enough aircraft or pilots to sustain major resistance. Allied air superiority was now absolute. Every major movement of German troops, vehicles, or supplies was visible from the air. Mustang and Thunderbolt units roamed freely, strafing transport columns, locomotives, and convoys with near impunity. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt by shifting to night operations and dispersing aircraft across smaller fields. Camouflage nets and decoy airfields were used, but Allied reconnaissance quickly identified real targets. P-51s frequently struck airfields at first light, destroying dozens of parked aircraft before they could take off. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft on the ground than in the air. The Jagdgeschwader, once elite wings filled with aces, were shadows of their former selves. JG-26. Schlageter, one of the oldest fighter wings, could barely field 20 operational aircraft. Others, like JG-2 and JG-3, were reduced to single squadrons. The effect on morale was devastating. German pilots understood that every mission was a one-way gamble. Even experienced leaders like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff could see the futility. Galland later wrote that by autumn 1944, we were not fighting for victory, but for survival. Desperate to regain initiative, the Luftwaffe launched one final large-scale fighter operation, Operation Bodenplatte, on January 1, 1945. The plan called for a surprise low-level attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, destroying aircraft on the ground and temporarily disrupting air superiority. The operation achieved initial success. Over 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged. But the cost was catastrophic. Nearly 300 German fighters were lost, many to Allied anti-aircraft fire and friendly flak. Worse, the Luftwaffe could not replace them. Among the losses were dozens of irreplaceable veterans, the last experienced pilots the Luftwaffe possessed. The attack, meant to revive morale, instead finished the Jagdwaffe as an effective fighting force. After Bodenplatte, German air defense devolved into chaos. Fighter units existed only on paper. Their aircraft lacked fuel, ammunition, or trained crews. The jet-powered Me-262 promised hope, but it came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. By late 1944, the Me-262 jet fighter had entered combat. It was faster and more advanced than any Allied aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. In the hands of skilled pilots, it could destroy bombers with ease. But production delays, engine failures, and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber crippled its potential. Allied air raids targeted jet bases relentlessly, and the shortage of trained pilots meant few could exploit the aircraft's performance. P-51 units adapted quickly. They patrolled known jet airfields, attacking Me-262s during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. Several of Germany's leading aces, including Walter Nowotny, were killed in these conditions. The jets might have represented the future of air warfare, but in 1945 they were little more than the Luftwaffe's last gasp, powerful but hopelessly outnumbered. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the Luftwaffe, as an organized air force, ceased to exist. Its headquarters at Wunstorf and later Berlin were bombed repeatedly. Communications between units broke down. Supplies could no longer reach frontline airfields. The remnants of the Jagdwaffe were scattered across Germany in isolated pockets. Some continued to fight until the final days of the war, flying desperate interception missions against Allied bombers that no longer faced real opposition. Others simply destroyed their aircraft and surrendered. By April 1945, total Luftwaffe operational strength in the West had fallen below 300 fighters. Most could not fly for lack of fuel. Adolf Galland, once the commander of the fighter arm, was removed from his post after repeated clashes with Göring over strategy. His replacement, General Gordon Golob, inherited a force beyond saving. Galland later reflected that by the end, the Luftwaffe was a ghost. We had the machines, but not the means to use them. The destruction of the Jagdwaffe had far-reaching consequences. Without effective air defense, Germany's cities and industries were left exposed. The Allies bombed at will, day and night. The cumulative effect of these raids, combined with the loss of fuel, transportation, and production, paralyzed the German war economy. In the last months of the war, armaments output fell by more than half. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. More importantly, the loss of air superiority meant that the German army could no longer maneuver effectively. Allied aircraft dominated the battlefield, providing reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction. Every German movement was under observation and attack. From Normandy to the Rhine, and from the Ardennes to Berlin, the Luftwaffe's absence was decisive. When the Third Reich finally collapsed in May 1945, it was not only because of battles on the ground. It was because the Luftwaffe had lost the air. The fall of the Jagdwaffe was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of a doctrine. The Luftwaffe had been built around short, decisive air campaigns and tactical superiority, not the kind of prolonged, resource-driven war the Allies could sustain. Once the initiative shifted, it lacked the structure to recover. The P-51 Mustang symbolized that shift. Its presence made the bombing campaign truly strategic, allowing the Allies to reach any target in Germany with full protection. It neutralized the Luftwaffe's last strategic hope and left the Reich defenseless. When peace returned, surviving Luftwaffe officers studied the outcome carefully. They concluded that no air force, no matter how skilled, could survive once it lost control of its logistics and fuel. Pilot courage and aircraft performance meant little without the resources to sustain them. In 1940, the Luftwaffe had seemed unstoppable, a force that conquered Europe under the shadow of its wings. By 1945, it was shattered beyond repair. From the airfields of France to the skies over Berlin, the path of destruction was clear. Continuous P-51 escort missions had dismantled the Luftwaffe piece by piece, stripping it of pilots, fuel, and hope. The Germans had once mocked Allied fighters for their short range, laughing at the idea that American planes could ever reach Berlin. But by the war's end, they looked up and saw swarms of Mustangs flying over their own cities. The same aircraft they had dismissed as impossible now escorting bombers that leveled the Reich. The Luftwaffe's fall marked not just the end of an air force, but the end of Germany's ability to fight at all. In the final months, as Allied aircraft ruled the skies unchallenged, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe had been undone by its own arrogance, and by a fighter it had laughed at, until it escorted bombers all the way to Berlin.